Welcome to the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit. These weekly podcasts feature expository messages delivered to edify the soul. Now let's join Pastor Dave as he presents this week's message.
I've entitled this sermon, Israel's Independence Day. So we are celebrating independence today. Our country is. We are as a people. And so to begin this message, I thought maybe I would just read a little bit from the Declaration of Independence. In Congress, July the 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient suffrage of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having indirect object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To provide this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Now the declaration goes on and gives the facts. If this was a resolution, these would be the whereofs. All these things that are listed here as the facts that prove their need to dissolve their union. His refusal to assent to laws. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws. He has refused to pass over laws of the accommodation of large districts of people, and so forth. It goes on for quite a bit. They have a lot to say there about why they are dissolving their union with Great Britain. And so I read this today because this is our heritage. This is important, and we understand the need for such a resolution to be passed in that day in 1776. That these men would stand against the, as they say, the usurpations of justice that was of our independence before us. And also, as we look now to the Scripture, we see that there's an Independence Day for Israel, but it's not in a good way. Notice verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah and said to him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us. So they wanted an independence from the Lord's way and his reign over them. their argument is a good one, really. We can understand it. They came to Samuel with reasons that as to why they needed to make this change. They could see the things were about to change for them and for Samuel, and they wanted to control the change. Isn't that what every one of us wants to do? We can't stop change, but what we want desperately to do is to control it, to manage it. And that's what they wanted to do. They said to him, "Behold, you're old." They knew that their judge was about to pass off the scene. It had been wonderful for Samuel for however many years he's been there, 20, 30, 40, who knows how long he's been judging the nation of Israel, maybe even longer than that. And so they knew that he's about to die. And it's true, about Hophni or about Joel and Abiah. They're not good. They don't walk in Samuel's ways. And they didn't want a repeat of Hophni and Phinehas. They didn't want that again. And it's bad enough that these boys are, they're taking bribes. That's bad enough. They didn't want the Hophni and Phinehas thing where they were actually physically and sexually abusing people. They didn't want that. So they see the change coming. They see what's on the horizon with these two sons. They don't want them to be in charge. And instead of making appeal to the Lord, they say, "Make us a king." They asked Samuel to do this. Make us a king. They wanted independence from the system of judges. They wanted a central, government. They didn't want the sanctuary any longer in Shiloh to be the place where they gathered. They wanted to have some sort of representative government, as representative as you get with a monarchy. And they wanted it right now. Then they said to him, "Make us a king like all the nations." Have you ever heard, and I know this is a rhetorical question, have you ever heard anyone say, "Everyone else is doing it"? If you've had children, you've heard that, haven't you? "Dad, everyone else is doing it." I remember when I was a boy, I grew up in the 70s, and that's when long hair was in style for young men. And my dad wasn't going to have it. He's not on me. And I begged him. I said, "Dad, everybody has long hair now." And he said, "That's fine for everybody, but it's not fine for my son." Of course, I've kept it short ever since. That's the argument from youth or from laziness, is that everyone else is doing it. So just because the mob goes mad over something doesn't mean that something is right. The wisdom of the mob usually is wrong. And they weren't like all the nations. They weren't like all the nations. They said, "Make us like all the nations." They wanted to be like everybody else, but they couldn't be like everybody else because they were a peculiar people. Now, I could go to several places, New Testament and Old, to talk about this idea of peculiarity. But let's stay with the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy, Moses says to them, "You are a holy people unto the Lord your God, and the Lord hath chosen you to be a peculiar people unto himself, above all the nations that are upon the earth." So the Lord had made them a peculiar people above all the nations of the earth. And so what they want to do is they want to step down. They want to step down to being like all the nations of the earth. Samuel must have been devastated. Notice verse 6. The thing displeased Samuel. Now, the thing he's already hurt over, no doubt, is the fact that his sons turned out to be so bad. They're not as gross as Eli's boys, but they are grifters taking dirty money for dirty deeds. And surely his heart sank. When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," his heart must have just sunk. What else, what other arrow could they have pierced him with? They had forgotten the deliverance of Ebenezer, apparently, when the Lord thundered on the Philistines. They had grown so cold to their confession of sin that they made there at Ebenezer and their desire for the Lord's presence that now they want to cast off those bands. They want to throw off that robe. They want to pull down that ring and crown, and they want to walk away. They have forgotten everything. Prayer is a hallmark of Samuel's ministry, at least in these two chapters, in 7 and in 8. And so Samuel does what Samuel does. He prays. He takes it straight to the Lord. The Lord is the one who is in charge of Israel, and Samuel knows that. These people apparently don't. They want just to make a change like they can, and Samuel prays unto the Lord. However, this prayer is not like the one in chapter 7. There he prays on behalf of the people as intercessor. Here he prays against them as their judge. We don't have Samuel's prayer listed here. You notice there in verse 6. It just says he prayed. We don't know what he prayed. But we know it must have been a prayer of hurt. He was torn up about this. Why would they want to walk away? What had he not done right in teaching them the Scripture? How had he misled them so that they come to the moment where they act with the mob and say, we want to be just like everybody else? And you notice the Lord's solemn protest. Beginning there in verse 7, the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people and all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. The people rejected the Lord, and independence, ladies and gentlemen, is not on the table. Rather, a certain bondage is about to overtake the land. Israel thinks that they're going to be independent. They're going to have a king. They're going to have all the wonderful trappings of monarchy. You know, we look at the monarchy in England and in other places, and we romanticize it. We say, "Oh, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it beautiful?" All that they do, and all the pomp and the ceremony and the glitz, the gold and the secretism and the highness of all of it. It's just wonderful. We look at it and we say, isn't that beautiful? That must have been Israel's experience as well. They were looking, they were looking at all the pomp in all the other places and all the great kings, and they thought to themselves, how come we can't have one of those? They wanted what they saw. Of course, you know what the old saying is, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Yeah, they saw green grass on the other side of the fence. They didn't realize that they had the best situation ever. It's not only, though, a rejection of the Lord, it's a rejection of Samuel. Look at verse 8. The Lord's still speaking here. According to all the works which they have done since the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. So they've forsaken the Lord, they've rejected him, and now they have forsaken and rejected Samuel and his ministry. As God's representative, the prophet and judge, Samuel was rejected by the people for something worldly and glamorous. Does that sound familiar? We do the same thing, don't we? We want our own independence. We want the bands of God's ways and laws off of us. We want to make our own decisions. We want to be our own judge. We want to be our own expositors of the word. We want to be our own directors of everything that we do. Let's not let God in on the picture, and especially God's representatives. Let's get them out of the picture. And so there's a wholesale rejection. The Lord frames it for us of him and of his man Samuel. Look at verse 9. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And now notice how the Lord outlines the tragedy that awaits them. If you look at verse 11, he says there, he will take your sons. Look at verse 13, he will take your daughters. Look at verse 14, he will take your fields and vineyards and so forth. Look at verse 15, he will take the tenth of your seed, that is your produce, and of your vineyards, that is, the out of the wine, so forth. Look at verse 16. He will take your men servants. Look at verse 17. He will take the tenth of your sheep. And then the final blow here is, Ye shall be his servants. So from verse 11 down to verse 17, it's take, and all they can see is, oh, won't it be wonderful for us to have that really pretty throne room and king, and it's going to be lovely, and we'll be like everybody else, and we can just act like the rest of the nations and all this stuff. And they don't realize what they're about to walk into. Ye shall be his servants. Anytime we reject God's way, God's will, God's person, anytime we reject that, we do not gain independence or liberty. We sacrifice it upon the altar of selfishness, and we gain slavery every single time. So this is Israel's Independence Day, but this is not a good Independence Day. This is not an independence from something evil like the colonies in America had. What they had in independence was wonderful because it was from something evil to something good. This is going from the good, from the best, to the least. They were going from being a peculiar people above all the nations to being just like everybody else. Why would they want that? Why would we want that? The bitter fruit of any government of men is the subjugation of society for the benefit of those in charge. All this is done under the guise of the benefit of society at large. Always is it done that way. Independence from God does not lead to a wonderful satisfaction. Notice verse 18. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king. You see what it leads to? It leads to a crying out. It leads to the subjugation of the individual, of the family, of the community. It doesn't lead to something good. Again in verse 18. Ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Independence from God allows the bitter root of resentment to grow. You made the choice. You made the choice. You take the licks. I can remember hearing my father say that to me when I was a young man. You made the choice. You take the licks. If you're man enough to make the choice, then you're man enough to deal with the consequences. And that's what the Lord's saying to them. You've made this choice. It's what you've done. And guess what? When you cry out, notice that last phrase, the Lord will not hear you in that day. This should have frozen their soul. But you'll notice it doesn't, because the very next thing they say is, nay, we will have a king over us. They completely ignored Samuel's warning. But of course they had already ignored his warning. Before he ever said anything, they had decided. Before they ever came to him, they had decided, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a king no matter what. Come hell or high water, we're going to have a king. And when Samuel said these words, the Lord will not hear you in that day, they should have stopped and said, wait a minute, maybe we better rethink this plan. But they didn't. They're crying out because of the oppression that they are under, and no answer from the Lord will come. Do you remember when they were slaves in Egypt, the Lord heard their crying? They hadn't chosen to be slaves in Egypt. That had happened. But the Lord heard their crying, and he came down and gave them a wonderful deliverance. Now, under the king that they had chosen, the Lord says, not going to hear you when you complain. This should freeze our soul as well. What choices have we made against the direct will of God that have closed his ear from hearing our cries? It's not that he doesn't love us. He's just letting us have what we want. It's what any good parent would do, right? If your child makes a mistake, if they go off on their own way and they make a mistake, sometimes the best thing to do is let them have it. Let them have their choice. That's the thing that's going to teach them about their choice. But, as I said, their minds are already made up. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 19, nevertheless the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us. The resolution of independence from the system of governance that the Lord had placed on the tribes was already written. The decision was made. No more judges, no more Joshua, no more Moses. That's the old way. It must go. Something new must now come in its place. In verse 20, that we also may be like the nations. Haven't we heard that before somewhere? Didn't they just say that? Where was it that they said that? Yeah, up there in what verse is that? Verse 5. You're old, your sons don't walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge over us like all the nations. And here they're saying it again. That we may be like all the nations. Here's the temptation to fit in and be like everyone else. Christian, you can't. You're not made that way. You have the presence of the living God abiding within you. You are not made that way. You're not made to be like everybody else. Stop acting like everybody else. I get so tired of getting preached to by these Christian artists in the music industry and in other places in Christianity today, and they look like the world, they talk like the world, they act like the world. When are we going to get it? We're not the world. And the world's not going to be won by Christians that look like them. We are different. We need to sound different and look different because we are different. We are above the world because we have been redeemed out of the world. We too are a peculiar people and a holy nation. We have been given the high praises of God to proclaim. We want to be like the nations. The temptation to fit in and be like everybody else. To say it like everybody else. And that our king may judge us, you see. They said that. They didn't want God's appointed man, but rather a steady line of one family so they could know who's next, so they could continue to control the change. Because kings come and kings go, and we need to be able to control the change. This is what they thought was safe. But safety was about to slip through their fingers. And they want him to go out before us. And notice this last piece, to fight our battles. You think the king is going to fight the battles? Who's going to fight the battles? All the men he conscripts into the army is the ones going to fight the battles. It's not the king. The king's going to stay back behind the battle lines. He won't be out there, go out before us and fight our battles. Really, they are deluded. But this is what we do. This is exactly what we do when we decide that it's time for a change. It doesn't matter what else has to go. We want to wash it all out, the good with the bad. Just get rid of it all. Want to be like the nations of the world. Want that greener grass on the other side. But then when we get over there, we find out it's all poison ivy. It may have been greener, but it wasn't good for us. What grief this must have been for Samuel. He ministered to them and judged them for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, who knows? But to what end? To what end? I'm sure he's asking himself that question as we read this passage. We enter into the moment, and Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. Don't you know this was painful for him to even speak to the Lord? This is what they said. No, but we'll have a king over us, that we might be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. They completely ignored everything Samuel had to say. What a disappointment. Not only his sons have not walked in his ways, but the people haven't either. He must have felt like a failure. The kingship would be a great blessing to Israel and a great snare. The Lord said to Samuel, "Hearken to their voice and make them a king." We know that through the line of David, Messiah comes, but we also know that through the line of David, Manasseh comes. Not only Manasseh, but so many other kings that brought the horrors of illegitimate government to the people. And Samuel said unto the men of Israel, "Go ye, every man into his city." Samuel's getting ready to do what they said. The Lord said, listen to him. They said, give us a king. The Lord said, listen to him. Samuel says, go, just go on, get out of here, go back to your place, and I'll make you king. We'll find someone. Of course, the Lord's hand is going to be in this as well. And we'll see more about that as we look at Saul coming up in the next chapters. But ladies and gentlemen, this Independence Day is a warning for us today. Not our Independence Day on July 4th, but the Independence Day that we see Israel engaged in here. It's not independence at all. And whenever we walk away from the Lord, whenever we decide that His government is not good, whenever we decide that His word is not worthy, whenever we decide that we want to be like everyone else, we are only trading the best for the worst. That's all. We're not going up. We're not getting better. We're not improving ourselves at all. He calls us to self-denial. He calls us to exclusivity in the gospel. He calls us to a work and a word and a way that is different than. It is a narrow path, and He calls us to it. If we want to be independent of that, then there is a problem. Let me read to you as I began with the Declaration of Independence, let me read to you the conclusion of the Declaration. After they make their long list of wherefores and whereofs, their reasons, we have this: nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessary, which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, peace in friends. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with the firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Jesus will meet you.
Thanks for listening to this week's message. Please join us again next time for another installment of the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit.